December 16, 1944. 13:40 hours. Near Bastogne, Belgium. Captain David Steinberg, Chief Medical Officer of the 101st Airborne Division's aid station, heard the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery and threw himself flat against the frozen ground. The shell landed 50 yards away, close enough to shower him with frozen dirt, but far enough to leave him intact. When the ringing in his ears subsided, he heard something that made him forget tactical caution entirely. Someone calling for a medic in German. Steinberg raised his head cautiously and spotted movement in a crater 30 yards away. Two figures in field gray uniforms, one lying still, the other kneeling over him with hands pressed against a bleeding wound. The kneeling soldier wore a Red Cross armband, clearly visible even from distance. A German medic, trapped in no man's land, trying to save a wounded comrade while American and German forces exchanged fire overhead. Every tactical instinct said, "Stay down. Let the enemy medic deal with his own casualties. Don't expose yourself to fire for the sake of Germans who'd been trying to kill Americans hours earlier." But Steinberg was a doctor before he was a soldier, and the Hippocratic oath he'd sworn didn't include nationality clauses. He made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it had gone wrong. "Cease fire!" Steinberg shouted to nearby American positions. "Medical personnel in the open! Hold your fire!" The shooting from American positions stopped. Steinberg stood up, raised his hands to show he was unarmed, and began walking slowly toward the crater. The German medic looked up, saw an American officer approaching, and his face transformed from concentration to terror. He reached for the pistol at his belt with one hand while keeping the other pressed against his patient's wound, ready to fight or die, but unwilling to abandon the wounded man. "Sanitator!" Steinberg called out in his limited German, gesturing to the Red Cross armband on his own uniform. "Medic! I help!" The German medic's hand froze on his pistol. He stared at Steinberg with an expression of complete incomprehension, as if the American had just announced he could fly. When Steinberg reached the crater and knelt beside the wounded German soldier, whose femoral artery was pumping blood through the medic's inadequate field dressing, the German medic began speaking rapidly in German, words tumbling over each other in shock and confusion. Steinberg didn't need translation to understand the message. This German medic couldn't believe an American doctor was voluntarily helping save a German soldier's life. "Pressure here," Steinberg said, positioning the German medic's hands correctly on the wound. "Keep pressure. I'll get supplies." He crawled back to American lines, retrieved his medical kit, and returned to the crater where the German medic was still maintaining pressure exactly as Steinberg had positioned him, staring at the American with wide eyes. Together, without sharing more than a dozen words of common language, they clamped the artery, sutured the wound, and stabilized the patient well enough for evacuation. When they finished, both medics sat back against the crater wall, blood-covered and exhausted. The German medic pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that looked barely old enough to shave. He extended a trembling hand toward Steinberg and spoke the only English phrase he seemed to know. "Thank you." Steinberg shook the hand, recognizing in the young German's face the same exhaustion, stress, and commitment to saving lives that he saw in every medical officer's mirror. "You're a good medic," Steinberg said, knowing the words wouldn't be understood, but hoping the tone would communicate respect. That moment, two enemy medics sitting in a crater, having just saved a life together while their armies tried to kill each other overhead, became the first of thousands of similar encounters where captured German medical personnel discovered that American forces treated them not as defeated enemies, but as fellow medical professionals who shared a calling that transcended national boundaries and military allegiances. The first encounters. When American forces initially captured German medical personnel, the Germans' terror was often immediate and obvious. They expected to be separated from wounded patients and executed or forced to watch while Americans committed atrocities against German casualties. The propaganda had been explicit and detailed about American medical barbarism. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Hayes, commanding a medical battalion attached to the 3rd Armored Division, described capturing a German field hospital near Aachen in October 1944. "We entered the facility expecting armed resistance. Instead, we found 3 German doctors, 2 nurses, and maybe a dozen orderlies trying to care for about 40 wounded German soldiers. When we came through the door, the senior German doctor stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in English, explaining who they were, pleading with us not to harm the patients, offering to surrender if we'd just leave the wounded alone. He was shaking, obviously terrified, but trying to protect his patients. I had to physically put my hand on his shoulder and tell him to calm down, that we weren't going to hurt anyone, that we were medical officers just like him." The transformation in German medical personnel's attitudes when they realized American forces actually intended to treat them professionally happened quickly and was often accompanied by emotional reactions. The relief of not being executed combined with shock at being treated with respect produced responses ranging from quiet tears to complete psychological breakdowns. The immediate tactical priority was usually securing the German medical personnel and their facilities without disrupting ongoing medical care. American commanders quickly learned that allowing German doctors and medics to continue treating German wounded while under American supervision was more effective than trying to replace them with American medical staff who were already overburdened. The medical brotherhood. By late 1944, as American forces advanced through France and into Germany, they were capturing increasing numbers of German medical personnel, doctors, surgeons, nurses, medics, and support staff who'd been providing medical care to Wehrmacht forces throughout the European theater. The captures happened in various ways: medical units overrun during rapid advances, hospitals in captured towns, individual medics found treating wounded in the field. The captured German medical personnel had been conditioned by years of Nazi propaganda to expect barbaric treatment from American forces. They'd been told Americans were culturally inferior, that democratic societies produced soldiers without honor, that capture meant torture, humiliation, and likely death. For medical personnel specifically, propaganda had emphasized that Americans would execute doctors who'd treated German soldiers or use them for forced labor in degrading conditions. The reality they encountered contradicted every expectation. American military medical doctrine, shaped by Geneva Convention provisions and professional medical ethics, treated captured medical personnel as colleagues who happened to be on the wrong side rather than as enemies who deserved punishment. The approach wasn't just humanitarian, it was practical, as American medical services were often overwhelmed by casualties and could use skilled assistance regardless of its nationality. The professional recognition. What shocked captured German medical personnel most profoundly wasn't just humane treatment. It was being treated as professional colleagues rather than as defeated enemies or war criminals. American medical officers addressed German doctors by rank and title, consulted with them about patient care, asked their professional opinions, and generally conducted themselves as fellow medical professionals collaborating on shared problems. This professional respect was particularly meaningful because it contradicted both Nazi propaganda about American barbarism and German military culture that emphasized rigid hierarchy and formal protocols. American medical officers' relatively informal approach, addressing even captured enemy doctors with professional courtesy rather than military formality, created atmosphere of collegial cooperation rather than captor-captive relationship. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a German surgeon captured near Metz in November 1944, described his shock at American professional treatment in testimony given years later. "I expected to be interrogated about military matters, perhaps forced to work under guard in degrading conditions. Instead, the American chief surgeon invited me to observe an operation, a complex abdominal procedure on a German patient. He explained his technique, asked my opinion on approach, and when I suggested alternative method based on my training in Berlin, he actually tried my suggestion and thanked me when it proved effective. He treated me as a colleague, not an enemy. I couldn't reconcile this with everything I'd been taught about American doctors being incompetent products of inferior medical education." The professional interactions often revealed that American and German medical personnel had more in common with each other than with their respective military commands. They shared frustrations about inadequate supplies, concerns about patient outcomes, gallows humor about impossible situations, and the psychological burden of trying to save lives while their armies were ending them. The shared professional culture created immediate bond that transcended national enmity. The collaborative work. As American medical facilities became overwhelmed by casualties from intense fighting in late 1944 and early 1945, pragmatic necessity drove increased utilization of captured German medical personnel. The Germans had skills, training, and experience that American forces desperately needed. Using them made operational sense, even beyond humanitarian considerations. The collaboration took various forms depending on facilities and circumstances. In some field hospitals, captured German doctors worked alongside American physicians treating both American and German wounded. In POW camps, German medical personnel staffed infirmaries caring for German prisoners under American medical supervision. In rear area facilities, German medical specialists provided expert consultations on complex cases. The working conditions improved rapidly as American medical officers recognized the quality of German medical training and competence of captured personnel. Initial suspicion and caution gave way to genuine professional collaboration. German doctors participated in surgical teams. German nurses provided patient care. German medics assisted with everything from triage to evacuation. Major James Morrison, a surgical officer who worked extensively with captured German medical personnel, documented the evolution. "Initially, we treated them as prisoners who happened to have medical skills we could exploit. Within weeks, we were treating them as colleagues. The good ones, and most were very good, proved themselves through professional competence. They'd suggest techniques we hadn't considered. They'd work 30-hour shifts without complaint. They'd provide patient care that met or exceeded our own standards. You couldn't maintain prisoner-captor mentality when you were working side by side saving lives." The collaboration extended to medical education and technique sharing. American doctors had access to newer antibiotics, better surgical instruments, and more abundant supplies. German doctors often had more extensive surgical experience from years of war and different training approaches that complemented American methods. The exchange of knowledge and techniques benefited both sides and ultimately improved patient care. The ethical complexity. The use of captured German medical personnel created ethical complications that troubled both American and German participants. The Geneva Convention provisions about medical neutrality were clear in principle, but ambiguous in application when captured medical personnel were working in facilities treating both American and German patients. For German doctors and medics, providing care to American soldiers while their own countrymen were still fighting created profound moral conflict. They'd taken oaths to serve German military, but they'd also taken Hippocratic oaths that obligated them to treat all patients regardless of allegiance. Working under American supervision to save American lives felt like collaboration or even treason to some, while others rationalized it as maintaining medical ethics under impossible circumstances. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German physician captured in January 1945, described his internal conflict. "I was caring for American soldiers whose wounds had been inflicted by German forces, perhaps by units I'd served with, perhaps by men I'd trained. Every American life I saved might mean more German deaths later. But I was a doctor. The man on my operating table wasn't an enemy. He was a patient who needed my skills. I had to separate my identity as German patriot from my identity as physician, or I couldn't function. The Americans somehow understood this conflict and didn't force me to resolve it. They just let me do the medical work." For American medical officers, the ethical questions centered on how much autonomy to give captured enemy medical personnel, whether to allow them to care for American patients, and how to balance security concerns against medical necessity. Most resolved the dilemma by prioritizing patient care above security protocols, trusting that medical professionals would honor their ethical obligations regardless of nationality. The material superiority. Captured German medical personnel were consistently shocked by the abundance and quality of American medical supplies compared to what they'd been working with in German service. The contrast illustrated broader economic and industrial disparities between the combatants in ways that pure military comparison couldn't capture. The material differences were stark and immediately obvious. Penicillin availability. American forces had abundant supplies. German forces had virtually none plasma for transfusions. American medical units carried standard plasma supplies. German units often had none. Morphine. Americans had sufficient quantities for generous pain management. Germans rationed strictly surgical instruments. American equipment was modern and plentiful. German equipment often outdated or improvised bandages and dressings. American supplies were abundant. German forces often used paper bandages, ambulances, and evacuation. Americans had dedicated medical vehicles. Germans increasingly relied on whatever transport was available. Dr. Friedrich Weber, captured with an entire German field hospital in March 1945, documented his astonishment at American medical resources. "In one American field hospital, I saw more penicillin than entire German armies had available. They used it routinely for infections that we'd watched kill patients because we had no effective treatment. They had whole blood for transfusions while we were still using plasma substitutes that barely worked. Their surgical facilities had equipment I'd only seen in major Berlin hospitals before the war. The material abundance was staggering. They could afford to provide optimal care for every patient while we'd been rationing and improvising for years." The material superiority extended beyond medical supplies to logistical organization. American medical evacuation systems moved wounded from front lines to field hospitals to rear area facilities with efficiency that German medical personnel found remarkable. The systematic approach to medical logistics, treating it as industrial process rather than ad hoc emergency response, reflected broader American organizational competence. The psychological transformation. For captured German medical personnel, the experience of working alongside American doctors and receiving professional treatment initiated psychological transformation that paralleled but differed from the denazification experienced by combat prisoners. The transformation operated through professional identity rather than political indoctrination. The progression typically followed recognizable stages. Initial terror and expectation of abuse gave way to relief at humane treatment. Relief transformed into surprise at professional respect. Surprise evolved into gratitude for being allowed to continue medical work. Gratitude deepened into genuine professional collaboration. For many, the collaboration ultimately prompted questioning of Nazi ideology that had predicted barbaric American behavior. The transformation was particularly profound for younger German medical personnel who'd been trained entirely under Nazi regime and had no adult memories of pre-Nazi medical culture. They'd been taught that Nazi ideology represented scientific advancement, and that democratic societies like America were decadent and inferior. Working with American doctors who demonstrated superior resources, techniques, and ethical standards challenged every assumption about Nazi superiority. 24-year-old Dr. Klaus Richter, who'd graduated from medical school in 1943 and served as combat surgeon until capture in February 1945, described his psychological journey. My entire medical education had been infused with Nazi ideology, theories about racial differences in medical treatment, claims about German medical superiority, contempt for American and British medicine as products of inferior cultures. Within 2 weeks of capture, I watched American surgeons performing procedures I'd been taught were impossible, using drugs I'd been told didn't exist or didn't work, achieving survival rates we'd never approached. Every day working with them destroyed another piece of what I'd been taught. By the time I was repatriated, I understood that my education had been corrupted by ideology, and that real medicine had no nationality, only competence and ethics. The closing memory. On May 8, 1965, 20 years after the war's end, the American Medical Association hosted a reunion of military physicians who'd served in the European theater. Among the attendees was Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, the German surgeon who'd been captured near Metz in 1944 and worked alongside American doctors for the war's final months. Hartmann was approached by Dr. David Steinberg, who'd retired as full colonel after the war and established successful surgical practice in Philadelphia. The two men hadn't seen each other since 1945, but recognized each other immediately. They embraced while other physicians watched in silence. "You taught me more about surgery than any professor," Steinberg said. "That procedure you showed me for abdominal trauma, I've used it hundreds of times, saved countless lives." "You gave me back my humanity," Hartmann replied, his English fluent after 2 decades of practice. "I'd spent years in military service where everything was subordinated to ideology and national interest. You and your colleagues treated me as doctor first, enemy second, or really, not as enemy at all. You reminded me that medicine exists above politics, that our duty is to patients regardless of what flags their governments fly. That lesson shaped my entire post-war career." The story of German medical POWs being shocked when American doctors treated them like colleagues was never about dramatic battlefield rescues or heroic medical achievements. It was about professional ethics surviving the worst circumstances humanity could create, about individuals refusing to let war destroy their fundamental identity as healers, and about finding common ground in shared calling that proved stronger than national hatred. The German doctors and medics who expected execution and received professional respect, who feared humiliation and found collaboration, who anticipated contempt and experienced collegiality, they carried those experiences throughout their lives and careers. They became bridges between former enemy nations, living proof that even total war couldn't destroy human capacity for professional cooperation and mutual respect. And it began with American medical officers who saw captured German medical personnel not as defeated enemies to be exploited or punished, but as fellow professionals who shared commitment to saving lives that transcended the temporary circumstance of being on opposite sides of a war. They proved that medicine's highest calling, alleviating suffering regardless of who suffers, could survive even in the midst of mechanized warfare's industrialized death.